Hey guys, it's Sarah with ExtremeTerrain.com, and today we have a review and install of the Rough Country 3-inch suspension lift kit with Lifted N3 Struts and V2 Monotube Shocks, fitting your 05 to 21 6-lug Toyota Tacoma models. This kit will work well for the Tacoma owner that wants a complete lift kit for the front and the rear of their truck, and wants one that features upgraded components as well. This kit includes complete front strut assemblies, as well as V2 monotube shocks for the rear lift blocks, as well as longer U-bolts, diff spacers, and all the necessary mounting hardware. The rear lift blocks feature a steel construction with a black powder coat finish, and also include these longer U-bolts so you can clear these new lift blocks, the factory leaf springs, and the factory bracket. This kit includes these N3 front strut assemblies, as well as these V2 monotube shocks in the rear, so you do get that lift that you're after in the front as well as the rear, but also upgrade these components in the process. These struts provide 3 inches of lift in the front, and these rear lift blocks measure in at approximately 2 inches and are tapered, providing 2 inches of lift in the rear. So you are getting a lifted appearance to your Tacoma, but because these sizes are staggered, you'll also get a more level appearance as well. Now, depending on the year and model of your Tacoma, stock tire sizes may vary. For our Tacoma, we have a 31-inch tire stock, which is what you will see in this video. And with this kit installed, you can fit a more aggressive 31 comfortably. It may make some minor contact with the plastic lip on the front bumper, so you may need to do some minor trimming. Now, we also have 33s on hand, so we did throw them on just to give you a better look. However, to run a 33-inch tire with this kit, you will need to do some more significant modifications to clearance those tires. So as far as the price goes, this kit comes in at approximately $900, which is middle of the road price-wise when compared to other options. And for your money, you are getting a complete front and rear lift kit that upgrades your components in the process. And as far as the install goes, I'm giving this one a 3 out of 3 wrenches on the difficulty meter. It does feature a direct bolt-on installation, however, you will need to do some minor cutting to get that diff spacer installed. All in all, it can be done within 4 hours, and you will need a professional alignment afterwards. So with that said, let's check out that install. For this install, you will need an impact gun, or a regular hand ratchet will work just fine. You'll also need 22, 19, 17, 14, 12, and 10 millimeter sockets. You may want a swivel extension as well as a regular extension, a pair of needle nose pliers. We also used a pair of vice grips. You'll need a hammer and a rubber mallet, a pry bar, 19, 17, 15, 12, and 14 millimeter wrenches. All right, so the first step in our uninstall, with your truck in the air supported, you're gonna remove that front wheel. Now, if you don't have a lift, a jack and jack stands will work fine as long as it's supported safely. Once you've done that, grab a set of needle nose pliers. We're gonna remove the cotter pin holding on that nut for our outer tie rod. So to get this cotter pin out, it helps to straighten the other side. Just go ahead and pinch those 2 pins straight. And once you've done that, grab the opening, use some leverage, and just pull it straight out. And now that your cotter pin is removed, you can get a socket on top of here. We're gonna use a 19 millimeter. Go ahead and remove this nut. Now, if the ball joint is fully seated in this part of the knuckle, it's probably not gonna come out from just force down. What you may need to do here, suggest turning that a little bit to give yourself some more room. Rethread on this nut to protect your threads. And then we're just gonna strike this side right here with a hammer to release this ball joint. Once that is released, go ahead and remove that nut again and pull it out of the knuckle. Next up, we're gonna remove the sway bar end link from the knuckle. Now you need to remove this 17 millimeter nut. You can do it with an impact, but if the end link starts to spin, you'll need a 17 millimeter wrench and a 6 millimeter Allen key to hold that end link steady so you can break it loose. Then once your nut is removed, go ahead and remove the end link from the knuckle. Next up, we're gonna be removing this bolt that holds on your brake line bracket, just to give us a little extra slack when we drop our knuckle down. Grab a 12mm socket and get this bolt removed. Remove the bracket out of the knuckle. Next up, we can also remove this second bracket that holds the brake line to the frame, just to give us a little bit more room here. We're using a 12mm wrench, just because this line's a little bit in the way. You can use a socket with a swivel as well. And make sure you remove the brake line out of this hole as well. There is a second ABS line that is attached to your upper control arm. What you want to do here is grab a 10mm socket and remove this bolt so that you can remove this bracket as well. Next up, we'll be removing this pin holding on the nut for your upper ball joint. And on the far side, this might be a little bit hard to see, but there is a tab that you need to release. And once you've released the back part of this clip, grab a needle nose pliers and just pull it straight out. Now you can see the clip that we released right here. Now you can see the hook part that we had to release right here. It goes around the edge of the nut. Once you remove that, we can remove the nut. Now that we have that pin removed, we can grab a 19mm socket with a swivel extension and remove this nut. We're actually gonna leave it on just slightly because we will need to hit this part of the knuckle to release it. You'll wanna strike right on the side of the knuckle in order to release this ball joint. Now with a pry bar, we can pry down on that upper control arm to give ourselves a little bit of slack. Remove the nut. And then release the upper control arm out of the knuckle. Now we can fully release the knuckle from the upper control arm, but since we have it hanging off to the side here, what we're gonna do is just have a bungee cord support this for now so that we don't damage the axle, which is still attached. We don't need it to fully support, but as long as we're just taking a little bit of the weight off of it, that will be better. Next up, we're gonna be removing the 3 nuts that hold on the top of the strut. Grab a 14mm socket, or we're using a ratcheting wrench here, and get these removed. You can leave one threaded on slightly just to hold that in place. Continue on to remove the rest of them. This one in the back is probably going to be hard to see, but the same process. Using your socket or wrench, go ahead and remove it. Now for the bottom of the strut, you'll need a 19mm wrench. And a 19mm socket, and get this nut removed. Now to remove this bolt, right now there's a bit of tension on it from the lower control arm and the strut. Now if you lift up on the lower control arm, you should be able to wiggle it free, and if you don't have a second set of hands, you can grab a rubber mallet and tap it out. In order to make it easier to drop our strut, we are gonna lower the sway bar. This step is optional. If you can wiggle that strut out with the sway bar in place, feel free, but this does make it a lot easier. There's 4 12mm bolts holding on this cover. Once that's removed, we can drop the sway bar down and out of the way. Grab a 12mm socket, go ahead and remove all 4 of these bolts. Next up, remove the other 12mm bolts. This one is at the back. Now we're moving on to the front 2 bolts on your skid plate. These are a little bit harder to get to. You can remove this plastic trim piece, or you can just grab an extension and pull it back slightly. Once you're on it, go ahead and remove that with a 12mm socket. Repeat that with your other bolt at the front of the skid plate. Make sure you're supporting this, as this is the last bolt holding it in. Now with all the bolts removed, you can remove this skid plate by pushing it slightly forward. That will unhook the front. Once it's unhooked on both sides, you can bring it down. Now that we have our skid plate removed, we can remove these two 14mm bolts on each side that hold on the sway bar bracket. Grab a 14mm bolt and get these removed. Now make sure you have something supporting this so you don't let it fall straight down. And now that we have the sway bar mount disconnected on this side, make sure you repeat those steps to disconnect the end link as well as the mount on the opposite side. And once the sway bar is completely disconnected, you can go ahead and slide it out of the way. Now there are two brackets there, so it won't come off the truck unless you remove those. But as long as you push this out of the way, we can now remove the strut assembly. We're removing that nut that we had placed on top just to hold it in place. Then we can bring it out and down and remove it off the truck. Okay, the next step here is installing the spacers on both of our differential mounts. Now before you can do this, you do need to trim the driver's side support brace. These are these two braces going from your frame to the bottom of the rad support where your sway bar is resting currently. Now the only one that needs to be trimmed is the driver's side, so you have enough clearance on that differential mount. Now to do this, all you need to do is take out 4 17mm bolts, drop this down, make your cut, and bolt it back up. We'll have you take a look at where our cut was already made so you know exactly where to make yours. And then once you've done that, we can get the spacers installed on both the differential mounts. Now on our Tacoma, this cut was already made, but I wanted to show you guys exactly where you should measure and how to do this here. I would measure with this brace still installed on your truck. You're gonna measure about 1 inch up and then 4.5 inches along. Once you've measured, go ahead and drop that, make the cut with a Sawzall, and then you can bolt it right back up. To remove the driver's side support brace, grab a 17mm socket and remove all 4 bolts holding it on. Then remove the 2 on the bottom of your rad support. You might need to pull back on the plastic trim piece under your bumper and have an extension to get to these. Go ahead and remove those with your 17mm socket. Now, as you're removing the last one, make sure you're supporting this because it's the last thing holding that guy on. Then go ahead and remove it. Now that you have that support piece out of the way, grab a 19mm wrench. Now grab a 19mm wrench and a 22mm socket. And what we're gonna do is remove this large bolt holding on our differential brace. Now repeat that on the other side with your other mount. Go ahead and remove that bolt as well. Now we have the included spacers. Go ahead and slide it right on top between the mount and the frame. Here is this factory large washer that sat right here. We want to reuse this, but we'll be using these new longer bolts with a washer. Go ahead and slide that through. And then slide it through both the mount and your spacer, back through the frame. Then we have a washer as well as a nylon lock nut for the top side. Now you can use your hand or you can use a pole jack here or a floor jack just to compress the space between this a little more so you can get that threaded on. Now we're gonna leave them loose for now until both sides are installed. So go ahead and repeat that on the other side, lining up that spacer. And then using the new included bolts, slide them through the frame. And then install your washer and nylon lock nut on the other side. Now that both sides are installed, you can use a 19mm wrench and a 19mm socket and tighten these down. Now repeat that on the other side. And now that you've trimmed that support brace, you can go ahead and get it reinstalled on your truck. Now with it in place, you can see exactly where it would hit if it were not trimmed. Grab your factory bolts. Go ahead and get them threaded in. I recommend lining up at least 2 before you tighten them down. Then make sure the holes are lined up for the other 2 as well. Then with your 17mm socket, tighten it down. Repeat that with the 2 bolts up front going through the support bar into the rad support. Then with your 17mm socket and your extension, again, you might have to pull back on the plastic just a bit so you can tighten these down. All right, now that we have our factory strut assembly uninstalled from our Tacoma, we can check it out side by side with our new strut assembly here. Now the biggest difference between these two is this assembly will appear taller when compared to your factory because it provides 3 inches of lift for the front of your Tacoma. Now this lift is achieved without sacrificing ride quality because of these premium N3 struts from Rough Country. They provide vehicle-specific valving and are preloaded so you can just install this strut as is straight on your Tacoma. So with that said, let's go ahead and finish up our install. All right, now we can get our strut assembly installed on the Tacoma. Go ahead and get it lined up with the top of the strut tower. You may have to wiggle it past the sway bar to get it up there. But once you get it lined up and these studs are poking through the top of the strut tower, slide one of the nuts over top just to hold it in place, and then we'll get the bottom lined up. Now you may need the help of a pry bar to sort of get that strut to clear in the bottom mount, but go ahead and line that up. All right, this next step is a little bit tricky. You might want a friend for this one. Go ahead and push down and back on your strut assembly, and with a little bit of wiggling, you can get that bolt in place. That's good. Then once it's lined up, you can tap it the rest of the way through. Now, once it's all the way through, you can thread that factory nut as well as the washer on the other side. We're gonna leave this hand tight for now. We'll tighten it down once the vehicle is on its own weight. Now you can install the rest of your nuts on the top of your strut assembly. Remember, we had just the one up here to hold it in place, so we'll install those 2 more. And this back one might be a little bit hard to see. Same process, just line it up over top and get it threaded on. Then with a 15mm socket, or I'm using a ratcheting wrench, tighten these down. All right, now at this point, we have our truck lower on the lift so that we can jack up on the lower control arm. We'll compress the strut assembly a bit just to close the distance between the upper control arm and the top of the knuckle so we can get them seated back together. We'll just jack up on that lower control arm just a little bit to make it easier to seat that upper ball joint. And now that you have that lined up, go ahead and slide your pry bar up top. This should help you get the upper ball joint seated properly. And once you have it through, go ahead and throw your factory castle nut on the bottom. If you need to compress it any more, you can jack up a little bit more and make sure it's fully seated in there. Then with a 19mm socket, and you may want a swivel extension, go ahead and tighten that down. Now that the nut is tightened down, we can install this cotter pin here. Now, if the opening doesn't line up with this, you can tighten this down a little bit more till the opening is in between each of these tops of the castle nut. Go ahead and line up that hook and slide it all the way through and click it in place. Now we can reinstall the outer tie rod. Go ahead and line it up in the knuckle and press it in place. Reinstall the factory castle nut up top. Then with your 19mm socket, tighten it down. Now we can install the cotter pin. Now you can reuse your factory cotter pin here, but it may be easier just to grab a new one. They are fairly inexpensive and come in big packs, so if you'd like to replace it, you definitely can because these do wear out. Slide it through the opening. If you don't have it tight enough, you can tighten down the castle nut so the opening lines up properly. Once it's all the way through, grab the other side with a needle nose pliers and bend it so it's fully seated. Now you can reinstall all of the brackets for your various lines. We're gonna start with the bracket that's on the upper control arm for the ABS line. Go ahead and thread your factory 10mm bolt in there. And with your 10mm socket, tighten it down. Next up, we have the brake line bracket, the larger one that goes on your knuckle. Go ahead and line up that tab in the hole in your knuckle first. Then grab that 12mm bolt, the factory one, and go ahead and thread that in. Then with your 12mm socket, go ahead and tighten it down. And finally, the other side of the brake line, this bracket goes onto the frame. Line up the tab, same as before. The brake line is a little bit in the way here, but go ahead and line that up. Then with your 12mm wrench, you can tighten it down. Now we can reconnect the sway bar end link. Go ahead through your knuckle, thread on that factory nut, and with a 17mm socket or wrench, a wrench makes it easy to see if this end is spinning. Go ahead and tighten that down. Now if it does spin, you can use an Allen key to hold it in place. So I do recommend leaving the sway bar disconnected until both sides are fully installed, just to make it a bit easier on you. However, once you're ready, you can reconnect your sway bar to the frame by installing the factory bracket as well as the bolts. Grab your factory bracket and line it up to the threaded holes in the frame. Once you have it lined up, grab your factory bolts and get them threaded in. Then with your 14mm socket, go ahead and tighten it down. And now that you have your sway bar end link and your sway bar mount installed on this side, make sure you repeat that process on the other side, and then we can reinstall our skid plate. Grab your skid plate and get it lined up on your truck. Now there's two tabs up front. You want to hook those into the openings on your skid plate. Once you have them hooked in, go ahead and line up the two rear mounting points, and those hooks will hold it in at the front, and reinstall your factory hardware. Go ahead and get it threaded in. Then you can go ahead and line up both of your bolts at the front. Get them threaded in. And then with a 12mm socket, and you may want an extension, go ahead and tighten it down. Repeat that with your other bolt at the front. You may have to pull back the plastic a little bit just to be able to get onto these, but then go ahead and tighten it down. And don't forget to tighten down the 2 bolts at the back as well with that 12mm socket. All right, and now that we have the passenger side complete, make sure you repeat all of the steps to install your driver's side strut. Once you have them installed on both sides, we're gonna head to the rear and start our rear install. All right, now we're moving on to the rear uninstall. We have our truck in the air and supported with pole jacks. Now, if you don't have a lift, you can use a jack and jack stands as well, as long as you're supporting that rear axle, so we can drop it down and install the shocks and rear lift blocks. First step, you're gonna grab a 17mm socket and wrench, and let's remove the bolt on the bottom of our shock. Now with your 17mm socket and 17mm wrench, go ahead and get this nut removed off your bolt. Now you can wiggle and remove this bolt out of the shock. All right, so now we're gonna get the top part of the shock unbolted. There's a nut up top here that attaches it to the threaded body. Now there is a slotted spot you can hold with a small wrench up top here, and then with a 14mm wrench, remove this nut. However, I believe this gets in the way and we can't seem to get this nut off with a wrench up top here. So an alternative, not the best way to do it, but it'll definitely get the job done, is to hold this bottom part with a pair of vice grips. And with your 14mm wrench, go ahead and remove that. Now you can remove the nut up top as well as the bushing and the washer, and then remove the shock off of your truck. Now we're gonna remove the U-bolts off of our truck. Make sure your axle is supported so that it doesn't drop down when we remove the nuts on the bottom of the U-bolts here. Grab a 19mm socket and let's get these removed. Now you can remove the bracket and set it aside, and remove both of the U-bolts over the top of your leaf spring. Make sure the bump stop stays on top of the leaf spring. Now you can lower down on that pole jack until a gap forms between the leaf spring and the axle perch. You want to continue to lower until we can fit our lift block in there. Now it might be easier to do both sides simultaneously so your axle remains even. Once you've lowered it down enough to slide this lift block in, go ahead and slide it in with the tab towards the bottom and the open hole on the top. You'll want the smaller side towards the front because these are tapered. Then once you slide it in, you can go ahead and raise that axle up and line up that tab at the top in your factory leaf. Again, these might be easier to do simultaneously, so you can do the other side at the same time. Now you can line up these new longer U-bolts right exactly in the factory location. Make sure you get them right in that tab on the top of that bump stop bracket. And they're not sitting outside the tab, nice and even. Now you can install the factory bracket. Go ahead and line up each of the U-bolts through the openings in the bracket. You may need to squeeze them just a bit to help them get lined up. The fitment is just very snug with these new U-bolts. Now grab your nylon lock nuts as well as a washer and get them threaded on to the bottoms of the U-bolts. Then once you have all of your nuts threaded on, grab a 22mm socket and tighten them down. You want to tighten them down as evenly as possible. So I recommend tightening down a little bit at a time. we can get this new shock installed. Now we already have the bushing installed up top, so we have washer, bushing, washer, just like factory. Go ahead and line it up top first, and then we'll install another washer with a bushing. And then we can get our nut threaded on the top. Now to line up the bottom here, you probably will have to compress this a little bit, and it is a lot stiffer than factory because it is brand new and it's a different style. So using a pry bar, we're just gonna help it get lined up in that bracket there. Then we're gonna line up the bolts in the opening. And again, we might just need a little bit of prying up on it, just get it lined up. But once you see the bolt through the other side, you can go ahead and tap it in gently with a rubber mallet. Then reinstall the factory washer as well as the nut on the other side. And with a 17mm wrench and a 17mm socket, tighten it down. Then we're gonna tighten down the top as well. I'm using a 17mm wrench just so I can see if the top part is spinning. If it is, you can use an open-ended or adjustable to just hold this top portion to tighten it down. All right, now that this side is complete, if you haven't been working on both sides simultaneously, make sure you repeat all of those steps for your driver's side. Make sure everything is torqued to spec, and you will need that professional alignment afterwards. But that is gonna do it for the review and install of this lift kit. And remember, for all things Tacoma, keep it right here at extremeterrain.com.